Epic has recently made what I am willing to say is one of the best updates in years, and that is of course the removal of shockwave grenades. But of course, this is Fortnite. It can never just be this simple, because outrage has sparked among the Fortnite community about the removal of shockwave grenades. And it makes sense, because shockwaves have been a staple mobility item. The item hasn't even been removed from the game since Chapter 4. And over the years of this item being in the game, people have grown to love it. Meanwhile, I can't stand this thing. So you know what? Let's have a nice civil conversation about shockwaves, so I can explain why I hate these little purple pieces of shit. And afterwards, you can yell at me in the comments for being wrong. Sounds good? Great. In order to discuss the removal of shockwaves, I feel like I should firstly summarize why I, and so many other people, hate shockwaves so much. Shockwaves feel like such a no-skill item to use. You throw one down and it launches you in any direction. Sounds pretty simple, right? The problem comes with the lack of a risk from this item. You don't even have to wait to use a shockwave, and you don't even need to think about where you're going. Because say, if a building's right next to you, well don't worry about that, you'll just blast through every single wall. There's no scenario where you can't use a shockwave to escape, and that's because there's no risk at all to using shockwaves. The only way to counter a player using shockwaves is to have more shockwaves than them and chase the player down, which just isn't a fun way to play the game. And this became a huge issue in the end of Chapter 6 and now leading into Chapter 7. You get a player low and then they throw a shockwave down and escape the fight. It made games feel tiring every time you had to think about whether I wanted to chase a player down or let him run for the 4th time this match. Now I've heard some people respond with the fact that shockwaves do actually have a risk that you can be shot out of the sky. And yeah, because like, so does every other mobility item. But with other mobility items, they have other drawbacks on top of being able to be hit. Items like the wingsuit or grappler have their own drawbacks, and you can be hit out of the air, while shockwave's only drawback is being able to be hit out of the air. And don't get me wrong, shockwaves are a great tool for rushing players, but shockwaves are also great for everything else. A little bit too great at everything else. Most of the times players get away from fights not because of a player messing up in order to allow the other player to slip away, but instead just because they throw down a little grenade and boom, they instantly leave. Take this clip from Cuzzle2's video about why shockwaves should stay, which is a great video that you should watch. I'll leave a link somewhere, probably in the description, please go watch it. But in the clip, Cuzzle2 manages to let a wingsuit player get away because they made a bad play. But the other player also got away because they made a good play. The other player hid behind a rock, because in order to use the wingsuit you have to wait for a cooldown. So hiding behind this rock gave cover and enough time for them to wait for the cooldown and wingsuit away. Compare that to the average shockwave play where you just throw one down and get away. The wingsuit has the risk of a cooldown, and in order to get away from the fight, you have to overcome that risk. And when you overcome that risk, you are rewarded with being able to escape the fight. And that is what makes a well-designed mobility item, risk and reward. And there are tons of other mobility items that have risk and rewards like this. Grapplers have to be used at extremely close ranges. Impulses make you take fall damage. The kinetic blade and the new blade I forgot the name of have a certain amount of uses that need to recharge. All of these items can also be shot out of the sky, but have other drawbacks. You have to work around those drawbacks in order to use the items correctly. But do you want to know what item doesn't have any other drawbacks? Shockwave grenades. So of course, as a result of this, they were replaced with Crash Pad Juniors, which are a much more balanced item. They launch you in the air just like shockwaves, but now you can't break through a billion walls. And they leave the pad on the ground, meaning you can be followed without the other player needing to have shockwaves. Or you could turn around to shoot down the pad, but you risk some of the distance you get. It's actual risk and reward. However, there is one problem with Chapter 7's introduction of Crash Pads, and that is that they are impossible to find. We've gone from a season with an abundance of mobility to barely having any mobility, because there's just not enough crash pads around. And as a result of this, matches feel like a slog. It's almost impossible to reposition without having a mobility item, and most of the times, you're not going to have one. If you get a player low and want to push, or get caught in a bad spot and need to reposition, you need a mobility item. Especially in zero builds where you can't build a skyscraper whenever you get shot. But I want to make one thing clear because I know people are going to take this the wrong way. This is not a result of shockwaves being removed, but instead a result of crash pads being made rare. Notice how I never said anything about changing how you need to push, but instead not being able to push due to the lack of mobility. There's a big difference between the two. And the main reason I'm saying this is because recently I've seen this clip of Nick A30 going around where he's caught out in the open and dies, with people saying, oh, Nick really could use some shockwaves right about now, in which for starters, Nick just got revived by the Kenny token, so even if shockwaves were still in rotation, he wouldn't have any. But I mean, yeah, looking at the footage, Nick could have escaped the fight if he had shockwaves. Welp, I guess that means shockwaves must be added back to the game, because I mean, how else was Nick supposed to reposition there? Hold on. Wait a minute, if you look at Nick's inventory, you may notice something. Not only does Nick not have any shockwaves, but Nick doesn't have any mobility items at all. So I wonder, would the result have been any different if Nick had a wingsuit or a crash pad or a launch pad? Let me ask people using this clip a question. What would happen if you take shockwaves out of that sentence and replace it with any other mobility item? If only Nick had a wingsuit, if only Nick had a launch pad, grapplers, rocket drills, impulses, or even crash pads. The situation Nick was in was not caused by a lack of shockwaves, but instead a lack of mobility. And that is the difference I want to focus on. Most of the time, people listing things that they can't do with shockwaves can also do these things with crash pads. I mean, seriously, is there anything you can do with shockwaves that you can't do with crash pads that isn't flying through a billion walls? And even if you don't like crash pads, over the almost 9 years Fortnite has been around, they have made several items that serve the same purpose as shockwaves without being such a crutch item. Grapplers can serve just as well for repositioning. Crash pads can get you from point A to point B fast. Shockwaves are not the required factor for these situations to work. Shockwaves are not the only item you can use to push players, but shockwaves are the only item that lets you easily get out of a fight. And if more mobility is needed, Epic could always unvault items like impulses or grapplers, because these items have drawbacks. In fact, impulses are just shockwaves but more balanced since you can take fall damage. Shockwaves are not the only mobility item that can serve this purpose. There are tons of others. I'm confused on why I saw a lot of players saying that shockwave haters couldn't just adapt. In which I have to question, do these people even know what the word adapt means? Adapting means to adjust to change, but last time I checked, shockwaves have been in the game for years. So how can you adapt to a meta that has been around for years? And if anything, wouldn't the people wanting shockwaves back be the ones who can't adapt since they're used to having shockwaves and now they have to use something else? How am I the one who needs to adapt to players having an item that lets them escape any situation? And now that you have to use an item that actually takes strategy to use, instead of adapting, you blame the players who don't like shockwaves for not being able to adapt. Like, it's not adapting to anything, it's just running away. I don't really have a good way of ending off this video, so I'm gonna end it off with saying this. Are shockwaves a stupid item that needed change? Yes. However, mobility is still an important part of Fortnite, especially in zero builds. But shockwaves have long overstayed their welcome, and they are not the only item that can do this task. Fortnite has a long list of items that can do the same job without being annoying. Mobility is such a hard thing to balance, but I'd say it right now, the problem is not the removal of shockwaves, but instead that crash pads are too rare. And I'm saying this because most likely a week from now, crash pads are gonna have their spawn rate buffed and nobody's going to talk about this again. But as for now, shockwaves are gone, el bozo.